So our panelists today, we have Sasha Barab, Kaveri Subrahmanyam, which I promised I wouldn't butcher it, and I just did, Doug Evans, Eric Marcos, Jessica Becker, Nathaniel Carter, and Sarah Berg. And how we're going to run this first session is we're going to hear from Sasha, Kaveri, and Doug, and then we'll take a break for question and answer, and then we will hear from Eric, Jessica, Nathaniel, and Sarah. So without further ado, let's start.
So thank you for allowing me to come and share my work. It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to follow up on the keynote and the other conversations. So let me jump right to it since we have a fairly abbreviated time. I'm going to talk about a particular project, but I'm going to try to do so to illuminate a more general goal of talking about the power of games. And in particular, I want to talk about the idea that we are at a time in which a lot of us talk about barriers in schools, but I want to talk about opportunities, in which I've been working with the project for about 5 years now, most recently funded to scale internationally through the MacArthur Foundation, in which we have about 25,000, well actually probably about 40,000 now, kids worldwide who are only there because a teacher has gotten permission from their principal to register their students, log them into a 3D world, assign them curriculum, and start to engage in a review process. So these are active kids who teachers have went out of their way to figure out how to integrate this curriculum into their classroom. And I say this primarily to talk about not just the idea of games are coming, but I want to say that games are here in schools, and we're starting to see a transformation. And the other part that I want to mention before I start is that while we do have probably 1,000 teachers who have come to our project through Facebook or other social networking websites, and they probably would have been doing very cool things regardless of whether or not we created this environment. We have a couple thousand who we went out and trained entire districts, all from Kampala in Uganda to Israel to the US, where you have many teachers who are there because the principal told them to be, who are now using this curriculum. So we've really worked hard not just to kind of present a curriculum that's reaching the elite or the people that are already doing great things with technology, but we're really committed to classroom change. And then a big part of the work is understanding the challenges and opportunities. So I'll move fairly quickly through this only because time is limited. And I will put 2 URLs up at the end and try to keep track of my time. And you can go and get a guest account and try the curriculum if you'd like, or read more about the project there or watch some of the videos. The project is called Quest Atlantis, and it's a multi-user virtual environment for grades. It was 4 through 9. In the last probably 6 months, we've had a number of 10th grade classrooms come on to do our modern version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, focused on persuasive writing and ethical struggles of ends justify means. For those of you who aren't familiar with the 3D multi-user virtual world, here is a 3D world. I'm a character. This is me. You can't see me great, but I'm walking around, and I would be using my keyboard to move that character around. And I have a backpack because I'm engaged in some science activities where I'm going out and collecting some water quality samples. And my particular backpack signifies to other people that I'm on that quest, if that makes sense. So in-game, I have certain clothes that are both representing of how cool I am, but also representing of the kind of functionalities that I can do. The first one was supposed to be comical. Moving on. And so you'll see, too, as you look around, you'll see other people that have different kinds of clothes. And if you went and got a guest count and you logged in, you would see yourself in all white because you wouldn't have earned any thing but the basic clothes. We are in schools. So in addition to me being a character that uses my keyboard to move around, and in schools I'm free to go to certain worlds because my teacher has assigned that world because they wanted to focus on, for example, persuasive writing. So they assigned the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein world. Or they wanted to focus on mathematics. So they assigned a world in which you work with a mayor to engage in understanding measures of center and what are popular opinions on certain topics. Or you get assigned to Taiga National Park where you work on water quality issues. And that unlocks new trajectories that other students don't do. You have a chat space down here. Like I said, we have people from all the way from Croatia to Uganda to Australia to North Carolina to all over the U.S. And so down here, unless my teacher has knocked off my visibility because I've done something to deserve such, or because I have a teacher who's nervous and has other constraints pushing on their decisions about how innovative they can be in their classroom, I could run into a student from another country. They're by visibility, so a 5th grader would never see a 10th grader or a 9th grader because that would kind of undermine a lot of their authority in-game in the way our curriculum has worked. And then I also have a home page which keeps track of my work. And basically, as I attempt Quest, I can upload assignments that either affect the in-game story, or if it's related to an out-of-game story, like collecting water quality in my community, through a metagame narrative, we tie real-world work in as well. Kids upload their work. They can either use in-game rich text editors or upload PowerPoints, Excels, movies. And as long as the teacher has the ability to show that, so for example, in here I couldn't upload something using Flash, as we saw in the current presentation, but as long as that teacher has that ability, kids can upload different kinds of work. And then each one of these curriculums are situated within a narrative curriculum. And in the best world, the teacher signs the work as, hey, I got your report on what's going on and why fish are dying in this community, but I don't understand what you're saying, Ranger Bartle. So part of the curriculum involves the teacher taking on a fictional role of the in-game characters as part of their review process. And hopefully that will come clear, because a big part of what games are is they are play. We have the old one. Okay, I'll go with it. Let me switch minds to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so the reason why we use games isn't just because they're fun. I'm using games because, unlike printed or even e-textbooks, what they offer are an entire virtual world in which learners are central, important, active participants, a place where the actions one does changes the world that you're in. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And a place in what you know is directly related to what you are able to do, and very, very importantly, who you become. And in a different slide, what I would say is that what we're trying to do is reposition content so that it has a use value. So when you learn water quality, you're doing it to analyze why fish are dying in a virtual park. Context, so that it changes based on your actions. So for example, in the virtual park, if you kick out the loggers, the next time you log in, the park will be bankrupt. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally, we're trying to reposition person, from someone whose goal is to achieve a grade on a test to allowing a 10-year-old to become a scientist, an accountant, a historian. Because in our view, No Future Left Behind is not about a test score. And No Child Left Behind means engaging them in a future that they can see themselves as doing something with academic content. And so what we're trying to do is allow 11-year-olds to become important people, at least in the context of a fictional world. And in one of our papers, or in a number of papers, I argue that there's something valuable about making it fictional, because in the real world, most 9-year-olds know they can't be a scientist who makes decisions that determine the fate of a park. But in a game, I can. So in an ironic way, games can be more real in terms of personally transformative opportunities for kids while they are learning than the real world. And I can kind of get into a longer discussion about that some other time. So stepping one back here. So the idea, again, is to take a concept like erosion and mutate it from a dictionary definition. And then we took in this case, this is a diagram from a textbook produced by some dead white guy, which is how most science is communicated from, and kids are expected to memorize. And we've hand-drawn it onto a piece of paper. We've crumpled it up, dipped it in coffee grinds, scanned it, and then we embed it. So as I'm walking down this 3D path, eventually I stumble onto this note, and part of the curricular process is interrogating what that note means in relation to why are fish dying in this virtual park. In order to do that, I have to go around, and I literally walk around and I meet what are called non-player characters. They are in-game bots that are designed to look like other characters, like real people, except they don't chat. the way that real people do. And we have pre-scripted them with dialogue. So they can say things like, wow, I see you're here. I thought you were talking to the loggers. Aren't you on their side? If, for example, I work with a group that is an indigenous farmer who is against the loggers. So we start to position science not just as a technical academic process of interpreting water quality data, but it becomes a socio-scientific process that allows the kid to understand why science matters. But very importantly, we're not just building stories in which kids can feel good. What we're trying to show them is that the only way to succeed in these virtual worlds is if you understand that a turbidity value of 27 versus 6 is problematic, and there's something going on at site B that's probably related to the lack of buffer zone in here, which causes erosion, which causes turbidity to go up. And so what we can do in a virtual world is we can create an educationally powerful narrative that is explicitly designed to do what in some ways the real world can't do for us, given our 45-minute class periods, given our commitment on standards. And even if it could, I don't think we want 10-year-olds deciding the fate of a park. And if we did, there's not enough parks around in the world for every 10-year-old to have an experience of agency and ownership over that decision-making. But in a game, I can give every kid that opportunity. And if I'm a good designer, I can do it in a way that ensures they understand the difference between a dissolved oxygen level of 5.5 and one of 4.0. And then they can work back and talk in a narratively rich way to the people around these worlds to understand what actions might be causing that scientific concept to change. Does that make sense? Okay. I have 1 minute, so I will wrap up quickly here. We have lots of other worlds beside the science world that you see up there. And this one up here is a modern version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This is an inner city world in which we've been working with Nicole Pinkert's group in Chicago. And their kids are actually producing media, uploading the songs, and then kids in our world go to a jukebox where they purchase the songs. And then that money, through a kind of global economy, transfers back into the remix dollars that are associated with their project in Chicago. So you have this really pretty outrageous, I've never kind of even heard of it at some level, projects in one game producing the outcomes, products that are being taken into another game, and then they do some narrative work in our game. For example, if a song is about an environmental problem and you bring a certain type of plant while that song is playing on the jukebox, he has certain actions that you can do, like fertilize them with love, that you couldn't do, whatever. So there's a mix of real-world and fantastical elements. We also do real-world places like Mesa Verde National Park, where we've been working with SciArc. They went in, they laser scanned the park, and then we broadened the 3D models and built virtual worlds around them. And then we worked with the park rangers to determine what was allowed to be fantastical and what had to be real. So I won't go through all the different studies, but if you go to the website, I'll leave at the end here, you'll see we've done probably 24 peer-reviewed articles. We've done comparison studies in math, science, social studies, and you can read about those studies published in different journals. The teacher toolkit, comments from teachers all over the world, and let me just get to the website, and we'll stop there, assuming it gets to there. So I will put the PowerPoint up, and I will have Eileen send it out if people want to look through at their own leisure some of the other slides. But I want to leave you with the message that teachers and the world over is looking for new kinds of curriculum, is willing to do the work that it takes to learn procedurally how to implement these games, which is not trivial, learning a whole new teacher toolkit, assigning different curriculum, monitoring students, dealing with parents complaining about a kid who talked to this kid in Uganda who gave out their phone number, said something personal. And we have literally tens of thousands of kids who are only in this game because a teacher has went through the trouble of getting a human subjects report, getting permission from their principal, and learning the technology enough to put in their name and give them a username and password, after which we have these kids logging in all over the world, from home, from school, wherever, doing assigned curriculum by this teacher as well as voluntary curriculum. I better stop there, and if you have questions later, I can answer them. Thank you.
So I'm going to switch gears now and focus on online media. And I know the distinction is a fuzzy one, but anyway, I'm moving from games to online context. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that wired teens are learning from living their life online. It's not as colorful as the previous one, but hopefully get your attention. I'm going to skip over some of the little introductory stuff that I had, but briefly, as we've already seen, young people are using online context primarily for communication, interaction, and information. And I want to focus here today on online applications and to a lesser extent mobile devices. We already saw that the two are actually converging, but just to make it easy, I'm going to consider them separately. Online applications. The ones that are popular among young people these days are email, instant messaging, social networking sites, and online games. To a lesser extent, you have blogs. Now, blogs are interesting because they've kind of gotten out of favor, the traditional personal journal type blogs, but you are seeing a little bit of a resurgence. One is the My Life is Average. I can get this to work, but the My Life is Average is really an interesting blog. It's really these everyday things that everybody is going online and reporting, and it's like a group blog. I think of it as a group blog, and it's also interesting because young teens take up interesting postings on My Life is Average and then post it on their own Facebook page as their status. So you're seeing some sort of a convergence there also, but I still haven't quite figured out the lure of My Life is Average, but hopefully one of these days. And then of course you have microblogs like Twitter. Twitter of course has not really teens really have not taken up Twitter as much. It's really an adult thing, so I think that's how it's going to stay. And then chat rooms. Now I am going to talk a little bit about research on blogs and chat rooms, although they're not used as much by teens outside. The reason being, I think both of them can be in a constrained setting, such as an educational in context. I think it can have a lot of pedagogical value. So I think it's really worthwhile to look at what some of the research has told us about these, online applications, even though they might be in older form. Mobile devices, what's amazing to me is that 15% own a smartphone, like an iPhone or a BlackBerry, and they do pretty much everything with it. They do interaction, mobility, they use it for interaction, they use it for information, and they use it for entertainment. What's really interesting, however, I think, is that it has become very important to teens' social status. It's now second to clothes. So clothes are number one in social status, and next is the kind of handheld device that you own. And texting has become very important. And this is a little interesting because I think it speaks to group differences. Texting has always been important among teens in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. But it's only been in the last couple years that US teens have taken up to texting in such a big way. Now, texting may even be replacing talking, according to a survey of the wireless trade group, I admit. But anyway, I think that is a real trend. And many of them also say that without texting, their social life would be worse. So it is, it's important to them. One last thing, I think Milton already spoke about this, mentioned this, the multitasking, the context of their media use. This is just a snapshot of a screenshot, of a teen girl at 9 p.m. on a weeknight. You can see the four, my daughter, when she was in high school, but anyway, 4 instant messaging conversations going on at the same time while she has Facebook open, iTunes in the background, and of course you see the little thing there, she's supposedly doing some schoolwork. So you do wonder about that, right? Okay, so moving on to the main focus of my talk, what is it that they are learning from living life online? Now, over the past, two things that I want to mention before I jump to this. I'm not going to, because of the short time, I'm not going to go into the details of the research on which they're based, but I have my email address at the end of the talk. To shoot me an email, I'm happy to give you the particular paper that it's based on. Second, in line with the general focus of this conference, I'm going to focus more on the positive, on what they're learning. I'm not really going to get into the positives or the negatives. I'll just briefly touch on that at the end, because I think you do have to be watchful for some of the risks that may be involved in all of this learning. Okay, so one thing that is becoming apparent is that much of what they're learning from online contexts is what we call informal learning, which is a kind of learning that occurs outside of formal contexts such as schools. This is what you learn in the home, in the playground if you're a young child, after school, and now online. So this is informal learning. And what is becoming clear is that much of this centers around what we call developmental issues in developmental psychology. These are the issues that individuals at different life phases have to grapple with. For young people, teenagers living in Western countries today, these are the three main issues. Adjusting to their changing bodies and developing a sense of their sexual selves, so sexuality is an important issue. Identity, developing a coherent sense of who they are. Who am I? Where am I headed? What are my interests? So on and so forth. And finally, intimacy, which is developing intimate relations with peers, friends, as well as romantic partners, as well as adults. So these are the three main issues that teens are grappling with in their offline lives. And this is, again, kind of getting back to what Milton was talking about, that digital technologies are situated in their lives, and you're seeing the same thing in their online lives as well. We see that they're bringing in these same developmental issues. So now let's see what they're learning from their online activities with regard to these developmental issues. Learning about health and sexuality. Several years ago, when we started studying teen chat rooms, we were really struck with the amount of sexual themes that were featured in their chat conversations. And what I have here in front of you is an excerpt from one of their conversations. Basically, these teens were talking about whether or not they should be engaging in sexual activity. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes you tend to think about this as something impulsive that they engage in without thinking about. But you do see at least a few teens are thinking about, whether or not they should be sexually active. Now, lest you think that this is just, one of the outliers, what we found was that overall 5% of all utterances in the chat rooms were sexual ones. These were unmonitored chat rooms, by the way. So that breaks down to about one sexual remark per minute. Now, I'm sure they talk a lot about sex face-to-face as well, but I doubt it's such a high rate. But essentially what we were seeing is that the chat room context was really giving them an opportunity to have frank discussions about a very important topic in their lives. Now, chat rooms, even though chat rooms per se are not that popular among teens, you do have chat rooms for gay teens. And for sexual minority teens, they can really be a tremendous resource and help them learn about their sexuality. And this could be particularly important for what we call minority within a minority. So for instance, a Latino teen who might be gay, or an African American teen who might be gay, or a teen in a very rural part of the country or conservative part of the country. For these teens, this might be an especially valuable resource. Moving on, what else? What about other forums? They use websites and bulletin boards to find out general information about health and sexuality, as well as more specific concerns. So for instance, teens with cancer. Cancer generally is a disease that occurs at much greater rates among older people. So if you are a teen with cancer, you don't have that many people in your peer group that you can turn to. So online sites can really be a good forum to learn, for instance, about chemotherapy, going through chemotherapy. How do you deal with that, kind of headgear that you might need. So it can be very useful. There's also websites for other quintessentially teen concerns such as eating disorders and cutting. The best ways to binge and purge, how you mask your cuts. Now, like I said, these are things they learn that may not be that good, but it is something that they are learning, and it is something for us to keep in mind. In summary then, online contexts help them to learn about their changing bodies and sexual selves as they adjust to their developing sexuality. There also helps them learn about other health-related concerns. Moving on, about the self, according to the Ericksonian perspective, developing a coherent sense of self is a very important adolescent developmental issue. And again, we see that they take advantage of these online applications. In blogs, for instance, we found a lot of self-photographs where the user pictures were often self-photographs. And they often change them too, day to day, sometimes multiple times in a day. And what's interesting is that there is a social component to identity, which involves other people's reaction to you. And so clearly what they were doing was using these representations, if you will, to try out different personas or different selves and see people's reactions to learn more about themselves. A lot of entries focused on peers and everyday life. These are just two examples of entries that emerged in our blog corpus. And basically what they seem to be doing, they're just creating life stories about themselves. And some theorists argue, identity scholars argue, that such narratives, such life stories help teens, figure out who they are and establish their sense of self. You see a lot of this happening on social networking sites. In particular, when you look at their status updates, a lot of times they have lyrics from songs, from music. And it's very telling. I don't quite get it, right? I don't quite know what they're saying because I don't understand necessarily the lyrics, but clearly they get it. So it's helping them again with that aspect of identity presentation. Now, learning about the self can also be important, can also be online forums can be very useful for ethnic minority youth. So for instance, in one study, they found that South Asian students use the internet to learn more about their home countries and culture. Up until a few years ago, the main avenue for South Asian teens in the United States was Bollywood. Now, if you really know Bollywood, not the movies that you see in the US, you know that Bollywood is not representative of the culture that's the home culture. So kids were getting a really, I think, bizarre view of what it meant to be Indian or Pakistani or any of the South Asian countries. So I think what these internet forums have really done is help minority teens away from their home culture to really learn about details that otherwise might not have been accessible to them. So again, in summary, it helps them with self-presentation, helps them create life stories, and explore their home culture. Lastly, learning about intimacy. In chat rooms, 11% of all utterances were partner requests. I like to think about it as them checking out the lines that work, what works in terms of setting up interactions. I'm going to move on just a little bit faster. Again, with social networking sites, they may meet someone in a party and then come back, friend them, and use their social networking sites to find out more about that person as someone they might want to hook up with or date or whatnot. There's some research that suggests that instant messaging interactions with strangers may help you deal with social rejection. And as most of you know, social exclusion is a very real part of teen life. So again, there might be benefits from these stranger interactions. I don't have time, so I'm going to skip on this, but Justine Cassell has done some wonderful work with the Junior Summit, where kids from all over the world have gotten together and so again, it helps with civic engagement, engaging with, broader society. Multiple conversations via instant messaging. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I do think it might help them negotiate complex environments that is likely going to be part of their lives as they get older. One thing that I want to talk about is, one of the things that we haven't seen much is that text-based communication is a very big part of online communication. And I'm sure you're all getting emails, and I sometimes do this when, I have too much email to deal with, right, at the end of the day, or when I've been gone. Now, so there's some research that suggests the greater use of textisms is related to lower writing scores. So what I want to throw out there, this is an example of maybe learning the wrong things, and an example where informal learning may impact formal learning. So again, I think this is something to keep in mind. So to conclude, youth are living and interacting online, and we are seeing that their online worlds are connected to their offline lives. Online living may help with informal learning about core developmental issues of sexuality, identity, and intimacy. But I think we should also be aware of the risks. So for instance, it also provides easy access to pornographic content. Teens are not very good at searching for health-related information. So while we want to use these tools, I think we also need to give them health literacy experiences so they know better how to search for that information and make sense of all that information that's out there. Like I talked about the bulletin boards for cutting and anorexia. I think the challenge here is they might make these problem behaviors seem very normative, so I think that is certainly something to be concerned about. Stranger interactions, of course, always have some dangers with them. And text-based communication skills may impact narrative and expository skills. So I think these are all things to keep in mind while at the same time recognizing the potential for learning. Thank you. Oh. So this is the website if you need more information. I'm going to skip there.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. in no small part because got in late last night, and of course my bags didn't follow me here. So sometimes you come to a lovely city like the Bay Area, and surprises happen. So especially glad to be here and to be on camera, especially after wearing my clothes from yesterday. So anyway, I'm going to change the subject just a little bit and talk to you about social marketing and the role that social marketing can play in children's health. I do a lot of research on social marketing. I also develop programs, so I hope that I can tie in some of these remarks to the first two speakers. For those of you who may not know that much about social marketing, it actually works. There is a growing evidence base in the field that shows that that social marketing programs, which are essentially taking commercial marketing techniques like branding products, such as the many products that we have in front of you, the iPod, computers, and so forth, and applying that to behaviors. In particular, applying it to health behaviors. And we've shown that, that social marketing actually can be very effective in changing behaviors, adult behaviors, children's behaviors. It tends to be most effective when we have relatively simple, single-choice kinds of behaviors to change. So a great example here in the state of California, about 10 years ago, there was the 1% milk campaign, which had a tremendously large effect size, completely reversed milk consumption patterns. Everybody's drinking 1% milk now. The best evidence from campaigns in social marketing tends to come from the tobacco, nutrition, physical activity, and HIV/AIDS worlds. And there's a growing evidence base for the use of branding strategies. So actually branding behaviors, the way we brand products, treating behaviors as the way we treat products in the sense that they offer benefits, that there's an exchange, that there's a value proposition. And if we can apply this to children's developmental and health behaviors the way we've been able to apply in some of these other fields that I'm mentioning, tobacco, nutrition, AIDS, and so forth, I think that we will have tremendous success. We need a lot more research, though, on this and how the behavior change mechanisms work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So how does this work? How does social marketing work to change behaviors in adults and kids? Well, the first thing is that you build positive relationships, just like any branded product tries to do, tries to build a relationship with its customer base. You try to increase the perceived value of the promoted behaviors, whatever they might be, whether it's using a condom consistently, whether it's engaging in physical activity if you're a 12-year-old girl, like the Verb campaign tried to promote. You also provide alternatives to unhealthy behaviors. So, why should a girl, not be physically, be physically active rather than inactive? What's the benefit proposition there? Why is that alternative more desirable? And in this way, we can brand healthy lifestyles. We can essentially create competition with unhealthy behaviors and provide opportunities to engage in more healthy behaviors that become more compelling and appealing to tweens, for example. There are over 150 publications in a recent review that I did of the literature that use these branding strategies in social marketing, and they're being used worldwide. Some great examples are the Truth campaign, the CDC Verb campaign, which I mentioned, which was specifically aimed at tweens, the Love Life campaign, which is a South African HIV/AIDS campaign, funded in part by the Kaiser Foundation. This is an example of the use of social movements in social marketing. The Love Life campaign is essentially promoting engagement with a social movement to stop AIDS and love life. If we could do something like this for the issues of digital media and building the education base in such a way that media are more integrated into education, build a social movement around that and get people engaged behind that issue, behind that brand, I think we would have a lot more success. One of the things that we've been talking about a little bit today that's very relevant to my work is the idea of parent-child engagement and communication between parents and kids. And in particular, the idea that parents can be facilitators. They can be role models, which may seem like an obvious thing, but I think we don't focus enough on that and how to promote parents playing social role model roles. There have been some good examples of this in the social marketing literature. Traditional PSA campaigns, for example, public service announcement campaigns using old media, if you will, like the TV Boss campaign, promoted parental TV use regulation. There are some more multi-channel campaigns like one called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Go childhood obesity prevention program in the city of Chicago that I've been evaluating. It's basically trying to change the the family environment in low-income families to promote and value nutrition and active lifestyles and provide opportunities to engage with those lifestyles. And promoting parent involvement and communication with their kids. These are all important strategies that social marketing has worked on. I'll give you an example of a project that I've been evaluating recently, and this is also relevant in terms of the methodologies that were used to collect the data using new media, which is the Parents Speak Up national campaign. It was launched about a little over 2 years ago, and the basic premise of it is that we know from the literature that early onset of sexual activity leads to a host of other risk factors. It basically encourages parents to talk to their kids and have an open, honest dialogue about sex. The target audience is parents of kids aged 10 to 14, uses a bunch of different media channels to reach kids, and has a very in-depth website, which has been the subject of some controversy. And what we did was we designed an online experiment using a panel, a consumer panel called Knowledge Networks. And using this panel, we were able to select out the exact study population that we were interested in looking at, parents of 10 to 14-year-old kids. And we were able to randomly assign them to either get the Parents Speak Up messages, advertising content, and direct them to the website or not. So unlike many social marketing studies, we were able to actually design a randomized experiment, which was great. And we then followed these parents over about an 18-month period of time, and we collected data from them at multiple time points. We exposed some of the parents, mothers and fathers, sampled separately to the Parents Speak Up content, and others were a control. And then we also gave mothers at the third time point, I don't know if I have a pointer here, that box right there, we randomly assigned them to get additional messaging to see whether more of this campaign actually led to more communication about sex. And then we followed them for another year or so after that. And basically we found the campaign worked. Little slide glitch there with that line through the top, but sorry about that. Basically these are odds ratios that show in particular, question 44 was interesting, about twice as likely that fathers 6 months after exposure to the campaign would have recommended that their child wait to have sex. Huge effect on use of the website as a result of exposure to the campaign, and some marginal effects on parents' perceptions that they don't know enough about sex to talk to their kid. This is a model, structural model that we developed that basically shows that there are mechanisms that underlie how parents are influenced by the campaign. In particular, their long-term expectations for their children, how they perceive the role of sexuality and sexual risk behavior in their kids' long-term success, likelihood for long-term success. That factor, so long-term expectations, no, I'm sorry, excuse me. If I can point at the right thing there, yeah, that box right there. We found mediated the effects of the campaign. So parents having long-term expectations that early sex was a risk factor was a big part in their decision to actually recommend and recommend that their kids wait to have sex. We control for a whole bunch of other things, including media use, access to internet, and so forth in the kid's bedroom. So I think that this quick talk points to some important things that we can do in the future with social marketing and media use. The Parents Speak Up campaign promoted parental involvement and communication about sex, and it used a theoretical model based on branding principles. So there's some evidence growing now for persuasive competing brands in public health and the use of multiple channels and social mobilization. And if we can target parents and kids with distinct messages, we can promote healthy media use through a branding strategy. I think that there are some important implications for that approach. We see that in other topic areas that I've been talking about today, that we've been able to promote parent-child engagement using social marketing. I think that if we can target parents and kids with distinct messages, we have the promise of actually being able to influence this issue in the long term. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I want to note that Kaveri and Doug both have articles in the Future of Children volume that deal with these topics, and in particular in Doug's chapter and in the policy brief that goes with the volume, a number of the programs that he talked about are listed and described in more detail. So thank you very much. And Sasha, your talk reminded me of when my youngest, who was then 4, was playing Zoo Tycoon, and he didn't want to invest in trash cans, and it was just a very sad outcome for all the animals, and he was quite dejected. So those are good learning tools. Okay, so we have questions and answers now. We have mics, so if you raise your hand, we will send a mic over. Okay. Sandy? There she comes.
Sasha, I have a quick question for you. You talked about the narrative, but I had questions about what the narrative actually was. And given that you talked about Quest Atlantis, it seemed to me like there might be some room to talk about heroes, that these kids were heroes, and I wondered if you'd co-opted the hero formula to make kids people who did things in their environments and empower them.
Okay, great. So two thoughts. First, in terms of narrative, a big part of our project has been to understand the power of narrative, and one of the tensions I was going to try to present at the end was when you get the context too noisy, the pedagogical lessons underneath the narrative tend to get lost in the storyline, but when you get it too tailored, it tends to feel very much like we're just kind of being pedantic here, and so you kind of move from, like, I don't know, a fable, or Aesop's fable would be kind of at the too explicit level, potentially. So, the way we have a metagame narrative, and that's kicked off through both a comic book and a video that's at the very beginning of it. And so kids can watch this story about Atlantis and this land in trouble and how things have gone. But then every game has its own narrative. So, for example, when we created the modern version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it was very much steeped in the narrative in which the town is being... a plague is kind of wiping out the health of the town, and there's this one doctor up on the hill who's been experimenting in some unsavory ways, but it seems to have developed a cure. And your job is eventually you get hooked in by the editor of the town to write a persuasive essay trying to convince the town that either he should be allowed to continue, and as a matter of fact, you can be recruited to go collect body parts from the grave, or that he should be stopped, and the implications are that the monster is freed, and so you have this kind of human dignity moment, yet the whole town gets wiped out. And so there's these real tensions in there. And so we have lots of what I call transactive narratives, transactive pulling off Dewey's work, in which both the environment and the individual are changed based on decision points. And we work very hard to make sure those decision points are pedagogically illuminative. So I gave you one example of one narrative that's fairly political in California, I guess, around stem cell research. But as part of the way that we tie in the game rules into the narrative, as I go around the town, I collect quotes that either support or go against my thesis that the doctor should be allowed to continue or not continue. And I literally stack them like I would in a persuasive writing where I have evidence, reasons, thesis. So we work really hard to cut across, and these go through multiple iterations before they get kind of available to the public writ large, where we work to see, first of all, is the narrative engaging to the kids, and then over time, is it pedagogically illuminative, and then do we even get outcomes on, God forbid, standardized test items. So hopefully that gets a little bit at their, the whole concept of in a game you become a hero, and you're a hero who can do something, and you matter, and why you matter is related to what you know, is central to why we are using games in the first place, and we think one of the biggest things that most curriculum misses. The idea that kids and their identities and the consequences of their knowledge beyond the grade are not part of the academic curriculum is, I would argue, one of the main reasons why we have dropout rates in some cities over 50%.
Hi, this is for Sasha again. I really liked the Quest Atlantics, but my question is, what accessibility features are built into that for special needs learners?
Yeah, one of the things I think that you can ask that of the MacArthur Foundation, that's one of the hopes that we get to do, is that we'll get more support in order to develop more accessibility features in there. We do have, I know of at least 4 different schools in which there's collaborative questing, in which one kid is moving the keyboard and the other one is describing. We've tried to make all the text such that it is available to most online readers, so that when the kids confront the different players, they can access those. But in particular, I mean, I was a special ed teacher. That's what I was trained, and I taught in Hartford, Connecticut for a number of years. And the initial impetus of this project was more around what we called in Connecticut severely emotionally maladjusted, and getting kids who didn't care about content to see meaning, as opposed to working with different types of physical impairments, such as visual although I do have individual stories I can give you. We haven't gone out of our way to add in those extra features, because we're just, to be honest with you, our staff is working 80 hours a week, and we're just trying to keep the site up for the number of users that we have right now. We're getting pinged, I mean, literally we went from 200 lines of chat that we review every day to 20,000 lines of chat in 2 weeks when we got the MacArthur grant. And so you can imagine that, we have 2 full-time staff that just review chat every day and make sure, we had to set up a whole system just to monitor that. So I think that's a shortcoming, and something I hope that we get stronger with. We are in a lot of teen teaching and special ed classrooms, but we don't have a lot of adjustments in-game for it. Good question.
Hi, I'm Jerry. I'm a student at Stanford, and I think the 3 initiatives you guys were talking about was really, really interesting, and I'd just be curious what the next milestone for success for you would be, and then what would overall success for your project look like?
For me. Who is that for?
That's for all of you.
Doug, you want to start?
Well, I think we need to develop ways of promoting the idea of healthy media use, because I think we heard in these talks about the promise and the potential pitfalls of media. And nothing that we have in this society is without both those sides of the coin. So I think we need to promote a norm of healthy media use, and we need to figure out exactly what that is that we're going to be promoting. That would be my next step.
Good question. I think I would, along the same lines, really figuring out how we can tap into all this potential. I mean, right now it's really informal. I think with video games, what we have seen was the biggest challenge has been making the jump from informal to formal learning. What you learn in informal context, to see how you can bring that to bear in formal context. I think would be the biggest challenge. How can we tap into these resources and try and make them better engaged in the classroom? One of the things I want to look at, for instance, is transitions from middle school into high school. It's a very tough transition, and to see how maybe social media, social tools can be used to make the transition easier, as well as make them engaged in school. So I think that would be, for me, the next step.
I think for me is we've been working on in-game editors that allow kids to develop narrative stories for other people, and so that kids can be uploading and sharing their version of Three Little Pigs from different countries. That's a big goal. Clearly the special needs, reaching out would be a nice one. We are in the process right now of developing an in-game translator, because we're in a lot of countries like Turkey, and we're doing a big implementation down in Peru, in which Spanish is becoming a challenge in terms of the language. And so part of it is those. And I think for me a big one is that, within 5 years we would be from 40,000 to 500,000 users who, when we go and look at the work that's being done, we're seeing kids really taking on the roles and really engaging the content in ways that are starting to change the expectations of what a classroom looks like and what a curriculum can be for teachers.
Do you still have a question back there?
You mentioned that you went from 200 lines of code to 20,000, and I'm a little curious.
Chat.
In the chat,
Yeah.
right? In the chat. Sorry. And I'm a little curious about your analysis and how you handle that, and if, when you're doing your analysis, you're looking at things besides the chat that's going on. A little bit about maybe the back-end data that you collect.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you do a project that cuts across research, teaching, and service at a university, it's really hard to do the research at the level you would like to on all the areas where you're doing such large amounts of service. So I will say that, tens of thousands of lines of chat each day are going unanalyzed beyond, are they swearing, or are they doing something really beautiful that we want to call to that teacher's attention. So right now, we did have a paper that came out where we talked about analyzing some of the international dialogue and some of the ways that kids were talking across borders, and really thinking through one of our big challenges is to avoid, as we expand, some sort of pedagogical imperialism, and looking at the kinds of ways that kids are taking out the meaning making. And is there a particular country's kind of slant that's starting to overweigh a perspective on an idea? So those are some of the kinds of things that we looked at. But by and large, much of our time in terms of maintaining the chat is simply when we see something happen, we deactivate that child from the 3D environment. They can still do their work in 2D. An email gets sent to the teacher, and then we try within 24 hours to find another example of what that student has done, or at the very least, a student in that classroom has done, to send to the teacher so they don't get embarrassed and kind of walk away. But we have lots of chat, and we've done stuff like looking at, for example, the amount of chat that gets produced in a teacher-controlled world as opposed to a student-controlled world. And in one example, what we found was in a world that was teacher-assigned, this Taiga Virtual National Park thing, there was 6 pages of chat over the course of the week. When we looked over in another world called Qville, where kids rent property and build homes and do stuff with it, with each other, good, reasonable stuff mostly. And there was, I think, 200 lines of chat. And this was a dissertation that was done by someone I didn't even know at the time, but who had gone through our human subjects down in Florida. And what she found is that 40% of the chat was collaborative work, trying to figure out how to build homes and make certain functions happen, whereas in the teacher-controlled part, there was only, I think it was like 5% that was collaborative chat, trying to work on an actual problem. So it was really interesting the way the kids shifted in the game based on the expectations of the world that they were occupying. But I probably talked too much.
That's interesting.
Hi, Dan Lappin with First Currency Research. My question is for Doug Evans. I'm curious, given the importance in the child developmental stages of the human body, as we've seen with Kaveri and Sasha, the nature of the body, the developmental stages, and this kind of narrative, where's my place, where's my body in the world? I'm curious about where social marketing for health information is as a niche. Okay? Looking at traditional PSAs or health literacy approaches, which have been primarily text, working through new nurses, or the school nurse and such like that. What's the potential for this whole health content and expanding that? Where could that go? What does the future look like? And where are we at today? Are we at 5% saturation of that? Are we at the 1% point? And is this going to explode? Because what I see from my background in neuroscience and medical science and such like that is it's a potential that could solve a lot of problems if we teach kids about what is the nature of my body in the world, and I'm using this technology to facilitate my interaction with the world.
Wow. That's a big question. What I take away from your question, and if I didn't take away the right thing, let me know, is that, what has social marketing done or tried to do in terms of promoting healthy body image and promoting an understanding of our bodies? And I think the answer to that is not enough. There have been programs sponsored, for example, by the Office of Women's Health in the Department of Health and Human Services to promote healthy body image among young girls and developing social marketing messages around that, creating a norm that a variety of body shapes and sizes and contours are all good and are normative. So there have been some social marketing efforts in that area. I would say we're probably, below 10% saturation in terms of what social marketing could reasonably be expected to do, given the kinds of budgets that are typically out there for the topic. I think there's a lot more to be done in that area. There's a lot of competition. When you talk about the public sector and the amount of funding that's out there for social marketing, it's not what it should be. And there's competition in the sense of competing for relatively scarce dollars to address a lot of different topic areas. One of the things that we focus on in the public health world that I work in is, what's the return on investment? What are the behaviors that if we were to change, we would get the most health or educational outcome? And unfortunately, I think that the area that you're touching on is not currently perceived as being one of those areas. Tobacco use, drug use, sex, things of that nature, obesity. That's where a lot of the focus is. So I think we need to have more money to do social marketing programs, no surprise there, and to focus on some of the other issues that play a big role in child development and education.
I think if I could just add to what Doug just said, one of the things we tried to tackle in the policy brief is there's competition among the nonprofits, but there's also a huge competition with the commercial industries, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that anyone in this room doesn't know, but the skewed amount of money that these folks have to do what they're doing and to promote healthy use of technology compared to the commercial budgets is so off. And so you're not only just competing with other organizations and other health issues, but you're competing with Vogue if you're talking about healthy body image and whatnot. And one of the things we tried to tackle in the policy brief was looking at not just what nonprofits are doing, but what for-profit industry is also trying to do with the help of nonprofits. Because my own opinion is we can't do this as nonprofits and education institutions alone. We have to engage the commercial industry and get them to agree with us that healthy media use is in everyone's best interest. There are more questions. Okay.
Hi, I'm Rupa. I'm a youth editor at New American Media. My question is for Ms. Subrahmanyam. You talked a bit about the risks associated with living online, and I was curious to hear your thoughts about, technology dependence and technology addiction among young people, specifically as more and more tweens and young people, and perhaps even people in their 20s like myself, utilize social media, online networks, information technology to communicate or express or self-educate. I see, an increasing amount of anxiety that develops when you're not connected and you're not wired. So I'm curious, when young people are utilizing it more and more younger and younger, how are we going to deal with that void and that anxiety that will just increase with time?
Good question. Well, first of all, in the addiction literature, I think there's some controversy as to whether we can even consider internet addiction along the same lines as, say, addiction to nicotine, or if it's sort of, if it's the the manifestation of a deeper problem. So I think there is that issue. Now, if you look at the literature, if you say, for instance, if you look at the aggression literature, if you look at the addiction literature, I think what you find is that a very small proportion of individuals are really at risk. So I think, and two things. One, when you look at adoption of media in the beginning, a lot of times it's sort of like a fad-like fashion. So you might be very addicted to your Facebook and check it 48 times in a 24-hour span period for the first couple of months, but eventually people seem to be able to work a little bit out of their system and seem to have more normal patterns of use. So I think overall, I think that's typical. So, but there is a small proportion of people, I think, that are at risk. And I think, while I don't have clear answers to how you do this, I think we are better off if we focus our efforts at that small proportion of people. I think it's the same with aggression too. Rather than generically saying you have this addiction, we need to control it, or rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you recognize that some individuals are more at risk for addiction or cyberbullying or whatnot, and try and focus our efforts at identifying who those may be, I think we might be able to get to the issue of addiction, anxiety, and other related issues.
Okay, let's take two more questions and then we'll go to our next panel. Right here.
Hi, I'm Sharon Packer. I'm from Sonoma State. I work with Title I schools. I'm a social worker and a pupil personnel school credential student. I was just wondering, first of all, I wanted to compliment you on teasing out the fathers, the importance of fathers in communicating values. I'm seeing that in some of the research I'm doing about success in school without computer, just that the fathers are very involved, and I think it's great that you have this in your statistics. Second thing, I was wondering if you separated out kids with ADHD and looked at their use of this and what the consequences were if they had ADHD.
That's directed to me. Not in my work. We didn't have the sample size to be able to do that, but that would be a great piece of research to be able to do.
Were you able to tease out kids who were in gangs or kids who wore uniforms to schools also? Because those are some of the salient features of kids seeming to either have a high end of problems or a low end of problems in schools.
Actually, the research, well, the answer is no, unfortunately. The research I was commenting on earlier was from a series of studies that we did on this larger campaign, and we were, in the data I presented here, we were surveying parents of kids. What we then went on to do was to go back and survey a subset of the kids of those parents. And so we have dyadic data where we can look at parent-child agreement about a range of topics related to sex. But unfortunately, again, we don't have the sample size to be able to look at some of those more refined subgroups. And some of that research is going to be published early next year.
Okay, one more.
Yes, another Sonoma State University person. I'm Carolyn Sarney, and I'm also a psychologist.
I'm sorry, could you just use the mic so we can all hear you? Thanks.
Okay. My question is to Kaveri, and it's around emotion regulation. Because these tweens and teens are both being evoked or aroused, as this question asker mentioned about becoming anxious. But to what extent is there also a soothing or calming down that might come about with when you're online or when you're wired, affirmed or validated? And it seems like I was reading your chapter in the volume, and it does seem as though you indirectly allude to that.
You know, it's an excellent question. If you look at, I think there's two sets of research studies that come to mind. One is the work on arousal. Arousal, as measured by physiological indicators, heart rate, breathing, and whatnot. In general, it does appear that media enhances arousal, and that arousal is related to restless behavior. And so one of the things that, I was writing in a chapter recently is that perhaps the fact that they have so much media in their bedrooms, they're taking their cell phones with them to bed, might really, arousing them to the extent that it's interfering with their sleep. And during teen years, they're already going through the delayed phase preference. They're going to they're going to bed later and they're getting up later. But of course you have these early start times, as Milton was talking about the technological agrarian society. So you have the reduced sleep. So I think that is one aspect of arousal. On the other hand, I think what you were referring to was the study about instant messaging and the benefits of with regard to anxiety and how it helps you reduce anxiety after experiencing social rejection when you instant message with a stranger. So I think there is that benefit, but I think the bulk of it does seem to be suggesting the opposite, which is that it's arousing them. And I'm not quite sure you're going to get the kind of soothing effects that you were talking about unless it's very specific. But I think the sleep is a very big issue because it interferes with learning. It's resulting in car crashes. There's a mood, depression. There's all of that. So I would say I think it's more in that direction.
Great. Okay, we're going to go to the second half of our panel, and we're going to start with Eric Marcos.